The line for Elspeth's supper snaked from her gate, past the dry creek bed, and disappeared over Hemlock's rise, every man, woman, and child in it holding a tin plate and a quiet hunger. The August air, thick as felt, carried the scent of hot lard and seasoned flour, a smell so rich with promise it felt like a memory of rain. They were waiting, the whole of Promise Creek Valley, for a taste of the foolishness they had once laughed at. The sound of chicken sizzling in cast iron was the only currency that mattered now, the only gospel worth hearing. In the shifting twilight, Elspeth's face, illuminated by the fire she tended, was calm and unreadable. She did not look at the length of the line, at the faces of the men who had pitted her or the women who had whispered behind their hands. She looked only at the task, the pale, dredged pieces of meat dropped into the shimmering skillet, the way they danced and seized, turning a slow, perfect gold. Each piece was a calculation, a small victory in a war no one else had known she was fighting. It was a war she had begun with nothing but a handful of coins and a stubbornness so deep it was mistaken for madness. What she did not yet know was that the scent rising from her skillets was not just supper. It was the smell of a new order, a world turned upside down by a flock of crooked hens. 2 springs earlier, the world had been right side up, which is to say, hard and unforgiving in all the predictable ways. Elspeth stood at the back of the crowd at the monthly livestock auction, a widow of 26 with land that was mostly rock and a silence that people took for weakness. Her husband, Tom, had been gone a year, taken by a fever that had swept through the valley like a brush fire, leaving behind a silence in their cabin and a debt at the mercantile. She listened as auctioneer Blevins sold off prime cattle and sturdy hogs, his voice a gravelly chant that coaxed coins from calloused hands. She had no money for such things. She had only the small cash she'd saved from selling Tom's tools, a secret hoard kept in a loose-lidded crock buried under the hearthstone. The arithmetic of her survival was a grim, nightly ritual. So many weeks until the debt came due, so many meals left in the larder, so much time before she would have to admit defeat and sell her land to a man like Mr. Sterling, who collected failing homesteads the way other men collected stamps. She watched the townsfolk, the Hemlocks from the store and the Gentry brothers with their sprawling ranches, their bids confident and loud. They were the solid pillars of the community. She was a ghost at the edge of it, present but not seen. Then Blevins cleared his throat, a sound of theatrical disgust. "All right, folks, that brings us to the last lot of the day. The cull flock from the old Miller place," he gestured, and a boy prodded a makeshift pen forward. A ripple of amusement went through the crowd. Inside the pen was a shuffling, misshapen collection of about 40 hens. They were a sorry sight, a joke of a flock. Some had necks permanently cocked to one side, as if perpetually listening for a sound no one else could hear. Others walked with a strange, sideways lurch, their gait a drunken stagger. Their feathers were a muddle of unremarkable browns and grays, some missing in patches, revealing pale, puckered skin. They were the birds deemed too ugly, too unproductive, too crooked to keep. "Now, I can't promise you a single straight egg out of this bunch," Blevins drawled, playing to the crowd. "But they might be good for a laugh. Or a thin soup. If you're not particular." Laughter rolled through the dusty air. Mr. Hemlock, the mercantile owner, called out, "You'd be better off eating the crate, Blevins." More laughter. Elspeth watched the hens. She saw past the crooked necks and the limping walks. She saw the brightness in their eyes, the quick, sharp way they pecked at the dusty ground, searching. They were survivors. They were bent, not broken. The arithmetic in her head shifted. It was no longer about surviving. It was about a chance, however slim. "Who'll start the bidding?" Blevins asked, his tone making it clear he expected no answer. $1 for the lot. Just to get him off my hands." Silence, broken only by a few chuckles. Elspeth felt a strange calm settle over her. It was the quiet that came when you had nothing left to lose. She took a breath. $2, she said. Her voice was clear and steady, cutting through the murmuring. Every head turned. The laughter died, replaced by stunned disbelief. Blevins squinted, locating the source of the sound. "The widow?" he asked, as if he'd misheard. $2 from the widow Hale, Mr. Sterling, the grain dealer, who stood near the front, turned and gave her a look of pitying condescension. It It was the look of a man confirming what he already believed, that a woman alone could not manage her affairs. $2 it is, Blevins shrugged, eager to be done. Going once. Going twice. He didn't wait for a third call. The gavel cracked down. Sold. To the foolish, to the widow Hale, for $2, a few people clapped slowly, a mocking applause. Elspeth ignored them. She walked forward, untied the rope on the pen's gate, and began the long, quiet walk home, followed by the shuffling, lurching, crooked flock that was now hers. The whole town watched her go. The journey back to her homestead was a gauntlet of silent judgment. Faces appeared in windows. Men stopped their wagons to stare. No one said a word to her, but their thoughts were as loud as shouts. She kept her eyes fixed on the dusty road ahead, her chin held level. She could feel the weight of their collective certainty. She had thrown away her last few dollars on trash. She had bought her own ruin. Her flock followed her with a surprising docility, a stumbling parade of outcasts led by an outcast. When she finally reached the turnoff to her land, a small plot of acreage the valley considered barely fit for grazing goats, she felt a profound and weary isolation. Her property was 2 small rooms in a cabin Tom had built, a leaning barn, and fields of thin soil studded with rocks. It was here she would make her stand or her failure. As she was guiding the birds toward the barn, a figure appeared on the road. It was Old Man Anselm, who lived on the far side of the creek. He was an immigrant from some forgotten corner of the old world, a man who kept to himself and spoke in a thick, melodic accent. The town mostly ignored him, finding him as strange as the herbs he grew in his garden. He stopped and leaned on his walking stick, his eyes, the color of faded denim, fixed on her hens. Elspeth braced herself for another look of pity, another unspoken verdict of foolishness. But Anselm did not smile. He watched the birds for a long moment, his head tilted. He pointed with his stick at a hen with a particularly pronounced wobble. "This one," he said, his voice a low rumble. "She sees the world from a different angle. This is not always a bad thing." He walked closer, his movements slow and deliberate. He crouched down, making a soft clucking sound in his throat. The crooked hen, instead of shying away, took a hesitant step toward him. He didn't try to touch it. He just looked. "In my country," he said, still watching the bird, "they say the world has 2 hungers. One for the belly and one for the soul. A thing that looks worthless may feed one. A thing that is beautiful may feed the other. But a thing that is scorned, that has learned to survive in the stony places, sometimes, that is the only thing that can feed both." He stood up, his gaze shifting to Elspeth. "People see crooked. They see useless. They do not see the strength it takes to grow crooked. They do not see the hunger that makes a creature clever." He nodded once, a gesture of profound respect. "You have not bought chickens, little bird. You have bought 40 small lessons in how to live." He turned and continued his walk, leaving Elspeth standing in the dusty lane with his words echoing in the quiet air. She looked at her flock, at the lurching, wobbling, indomitable birds, and for the first time since Tom's death, she felt not the weight of her loneliness, but the first stirrings of a fierce and defiant hope. The work began before the next dawn. While the valley slept, Elspeth was in the leaning barn, prying warped boards from the far wall where the roof had begun to sag. Her hands, softened by a year of grieving, quickly grew rough again. She found a rhythm in the labor: pry, pull, stack, measure, saw, hammer. She was building a coop, a proper home for her flock. She worked with a methodical patience, refusing to be rushed. Every nail driven home was an act of faith. Every squared corner was a repudiation of the town's mockery. The arithmetic that haunted her nights began to change. It was no longer just a tally of dwindling resources, but a calculation of possibility. 40 hens. If even half of them laid an egg every other day, that was 10 eggs a day. 70 eggs a week. Enough to eat, and perhaps a few dozen to sell. It was a fragile equation, built on hope and crooked poultry, but it was better than the slow subtraction of despair. During the day, she let the flock range over her rocky pasture. She sat on the porch steps for hours, watching them. She learned their strange social order, their individual quirks. They were not a uniform mass of livestock. They were a community of survivors. She began to name them. There was Seidel, who always walked as if breasting a strong wind. Wobble, the hen Anselm had pointed out, whose head tilt gave her a perpetually quizzical expression. One-Eye Jean, a fierce little bird who was the undisputed matriarch of the flock. She named them all, whispering their names as she scattered the meager handfuls of grain she could afford. This private act of naming was a secret she kept for herself. It was a way of claiming them, of forging a bond that went deeper than ownership. The town, she knew, would have found it the final proof of her madness. A boy began to appear at the edge of her property. He was about 10 years old, with eyes too big for his face and clothes that were clean but patched. His name was Silas, the youngest son of a sharecropper whose spirit had been broken by years of poor harvests. Silas was a quiet, watchful boy, an outcast in his own way, always at the periphery of the rough-and-tumble games of the other children. He never came close, just stood by the split-rail fence, watching her work, watching the strange, lurching birds. He seemed fascinated by them. Elspeth didn't call out to him. She understood the caution of the overlooked. She simply continued her work, leaving a pail of fresh water near the fence line, an unspoken invitation. One afternoon, he was no longer at the fence. He was inside her property, silently pulling thistle from the ground near the new coop. He didn't look up as she approached. He just kept working, his small hands sure and steady. From that day on, he was simply there. Silas never explained why he came, and Elspeth never asked. A silent understanding passed between the woman, the boy, and the flock of crooked hens. They were a family of misfits, finding their center on the valley's forgotten land. Silas had a gift with the birds. He moved among them with a gentleness that calmed their skittish natures. He learned to imitate their soft clucks and calls, and they would gather around him, their odd heads cocked as if listening to a language only they understood. It was Silas who made the first crucial discovery. One afternoon, he came running to Elspeth, his face alight with excitement, his hands cupped. Inside was a collection of fat, white grubs and 3 small river snails. "They eat these," he whispered, as if sharing a state secret. "Down by the creek bed. They peck 'em right out of the mud." Elspeth followed him to the thin ribbon of water that marked her property line. She watched as Seidel and Wobble and the others scratched and foraged with an astonishing efficiency, unearthing insects and snails and nibbling on the bitter weeds that other livestock wouldn't touch. A new line was added to Elspeth's arithmetic. The hens were feeding themselves. The grain she bought from the mercantile could be a supplement, not their staple. Her meager savings would last longer. Her fragile equation was stabilizing. Then came the first egg. Silas found it in a nest of dried grass tucked under a wild rose bush. It was smaller than a normal egg, and its shell was a pale, creamy blue, speckled with brown. He brought it to Elspeth, holding it in his hands as if it were a jewel. That evening, she cracked it into a hot skillet. The yolk was not the pale yellow she was used to. It was a deep, fiery orange, the color of a harvest sunset. It sizzled in the pan, and the smell was rich and earthy. She and Silas shared it, wordlessly, with a piece of stale bread. The taste was unlike any egg she had ever eaten. It was dense, creamy, with a subtle, wild flavor that spoke of grubs and weeds and creek mud. It was the taste of the stony places Anselm had talked about. Soon, there were more eggs. They found nests all over the property, tucked into the most unlikely spots. The hens were laying. The crooked bodies were producing something beautiful and strange and utterly perfect. This was their first real secret, a treasure of sunset-colored yolks and speckled blue shells. They banked it like a coal low under ash, a private warmth against the world's cold judgment. They ate like kings, and no one in the valley knew. By the end of the first summer, the flock was thriving. Their feathers grew glossy, their strange gaits more confident. They were no longer a shuffling collection of rejects, but a proud, quirky clan. One afternoon, One-Eye Jean, the matriarch, finally stopped laying. Elspeth knew what this meant. With a heavy heart, she and Silas did what had to be done on a farm. That night, she decided to roast the bird. It was a risk. Cull birds were supposed to be tough and stringy. But she owed it to the hen to not waste the gift of her life. She seasoned it with the wild herbs Anselm had taught her to identify and slow roasted it over the fire. The smell that filled the small cabin was astonishing. It was not the familiar scent of chicken. It was deeper, richer, with a gamey note that was both wild and comforting. The meat, when she carved it, was not the pale, anemic flesh of a coop-raised bird. It was a dark, succulent rose color, and it fell from the bone. The flavor was a revelation. It was the concentrated essence of the land itself. The earth, the creek, the sun. This, she realized, was the flock's true secret. Not just the eggs, but the meat. It was the taste of a creature that had worked for its living, that had strength in its crooked bones. One day in late autumn, a riverboat, the Delta Queen, put in at the town landing for repairs to its paddle wheel. From it descended a large man in a white apron, sweating in the unseasonable heat. He was the boat's cook, a man named Jules from New Orleans, and he was in a foul temper. He found the town's offerings of pork and cornmeal to be an insult to his craft. He stormed through Hemlock's mercantile, dismissing everything with a wave of his hand. "This is not food," he declared to the whole store. "This is mere sustenance." Desperate for anything fresh, he walked out of town, following the creek. The walk led him, eventually, to the edge of Elspeth's property. He was drawn not by a sight, but by a smell. Elspeth was frying a small portion of chicken for herself and Silas, a simple midday meal. To Jules, the aroma that drifted on the air was anything but simple. It was complex, earthy, and utterly compelling. He followed his nose to her cabin. He saw the woman and the boy, and the absurd flock of chickens scratching in the yard. He was a proud man, but he was a chef first. "Pardon, madam," he said, his voice a low, musical baritone. "I do not wish to impose. But what is that you are cooking?" Elspeth, startled, simply held out the skillet. Jules produced a small fork from his pocket, as if it were a surgeon's instrument. He speared a small piece of the golden brown meat, blew on it, and placed it in his mouth. He closed his eyes. His whole body went still. The town's judgment, the mockery, the whispers, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the verdict of this one man. He opened his eyes. They were wide with a kind of religious awe. "Mon Dieu," he whispered. In all my years, he didn't need to finish. He bought every bird she was willing to sell, paying her not in credit at the mercantile, but in heavy silver dollars that shone like fallen stars in her palm. It was more money than she had seen in her life. The silver from Jules was a secret hoard, buried in a new crock beside the first one. It was a buffer, a wall against the coming winter and the debt that still loomed. But as winter gave way to a dry, brittle spring, a new and more insidious threat arrived. The sky, which should have been a soft, promising blue, turned to a sheet of hammered brass. The spring rains never came. By May, the creek on Elspeth's property had shrunk to a muddy trickle. The fields of the Gentry brothers, usually lush with new corn, were acres of withered, yellowing stalks. A blight had come with the drought, a black rot that climbed the corn and left the ears hollow and dusty. Whispers began to circulate in town, quiet and fearful at first, then louder. The cattle were sickening. A wasting disease was thinning the herds, leaving the animals gaunt and weak. The valley, which had always prided itself on its abundance, was contracting. Fear, like the drought, settled over everything, cracking the community's placid surface. At Hemlock's mercantile, the shelves grew steadily barer. The mockery that had once been directed at Elspeth and her crooked flock vanished, replaced by a grim, anxious silence. Hunger changes a town. It strips away the easy confidence and leaves the bones of fear exposed. Elspeth's flock, however, seemed immune. Their strange, foraged diet of grubs and weeds and river snails sustained them. They continued to scratch and peck in the hard, dry dirt. They continued to lay their speckled, blue-shelled eggs. They continued to thrive in the stony places. And people began to notice. The valley's most prominent citizen, Mr. Sterling, noticed most of all. Sterling was a man who had built his wealth on the misfortunes of others. He was a grain dealer, a moneylender, and he held the mortgages on half the homesteads in the valley, including Elspeth's. He saw the blight and the drought not as a disaster, but as an opportunity. He watched as his neighbors grew more desperate, his ledgers filling with their debts. And he watched Elspeth's property. He saw the healthy, active flock, and he understood, with the cold clarity of a predator, that she was sitting on the only reliable source of fresh meat for 100 miles. He began to circle, his visits to town becoming more frequent, his eyes lingering on the road that led to her gate. He smelled profit, and his patience was beginning to wear thin. The arithmetic of the valley was changing, and he intended to be the one who controlled the final sum. One sweltering afternoon, Sterling's buggy appeared at the end of Elspeth's lane. He tied his horse to the fence and walked toward the cabin with the confident stride of a man who believed he owned everything he surveyed. Elspeth was mending a coop door, with Silas quietly feeding the hens nearby. She saw him coming and stood, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. She met him on the porch steps, creating a small bastion of territory. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice even. "Mrs. Hale," he replied, tipping his hat. His smile was a thin, dry thing that didn't reach his eyes. "I see your enterprise continues to flourish." He waved a hand toward the flock, the word enterprise dripping with condescension. "In these difficult times, it is a blessing to see such resilience." He paused, letting the silence hang in the hot air. Of course, a young woman alone, with such a valuable asset, it must be a great burden. The worry. The work. Elspeth said nothing. She had learned that silence was a language men like Sterling did not understand and could not manipulate. She simply waited. His smile tightened. "I have come to make you an offer. A generous one. I will buy your entire flock. And in consideration of your difficult position, I will forgive the outstanding debt on this property. You would be free and clear. A fresh start." It was a cunning proposal. He was offering her security, a release from the fear that had been her constant companion. He was offering her an easy way out. But she heard what he wasn't saying. He wanted her secret. He wanted the rich meat and the sunset yolks to sell downriver for a fortune, leaving the valley to its hunger. He wanted to profit from the very thing she had built from scorn and patience. "They are not for sale," she said. The words were quiet, but they had the weight of forged iron. Sterling's facade of false warmth cracked. "Mrs. Hale, you must be practical. This is not a time for sentiment over a few chickens. You have a mortgage payment due in 2 months. The whole valley is failing. Where do you imagine you will get the money?" His voice was cold now, the voice of a man accustomed to getting his way. "How did you know the count of my flock to make your offer?" Elspeth asked, her gaze unwavering. Sterling froze. A flicker of surprise, then anger, crossed his face. He had let it slip. He had been watching, counting, assessing her worth like any other commodity. "That is neither here nor there," he snapped. "The offer stands. I suggest you consider it carefully." "I have," Elspeth said. "The answer is no." He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes promising a reckoning. Then he turned on his heel and strode back to his buggy, the dust rising in angry puffs behind him. Elspeth stood on the porch, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The arithmetic had changed once more. It was no longer about survival. It was about defiance. The drought deepened. The sun baked the valley until the very air seemed to crackle. The last of the town's reserves began to dwindle. The faces Elspeth saw on her rare trips to the mercantile were gaunt, the eyes of her neighbors hollowed out with worry. Pride, once the valley's most abundant crop, was failing. One evening, just as twilight bled across the sky, there was a hesitant knock at her door. It was Mrs. Hemlock, the mercantile owner's wife, a woman who had always treated Elspeth with a kind of brittle, pitying disdain. Now, her fine dress was dusty, her face pale and strained. She did not meet Elspeth's eyes. "Mrs. Hale," she began, her voice a dry whisper. "My children, they haven't had a proper meal in 3 days. The boy has a fever." She finally looked up, and Elspeth saw that the woman's pride had been burned away, leaving only a raw and desperate fear. "I know what we all said," Mrs. Hemlock stumbled on. "About your hens. We were wrong. I have no money. But I would work. I would do anything." This was the moment. The pivot upon which everything would turn. Elspeth could have closed the door. She could have savored the reversal, the victory of being right when everyone else was wrong. She looked past Mrs. Hemlock's shoulder and saw the lights of the town flickering in the dusk, small pockets of hunger and fear. She thought of Anselm's words about the 2 hungers. The town was starving, but not just for food. They were starving for hope. In that instant, she made her choice. It was not a choice born of calculation, but of a deep,